Thanks for everyone for being here. My name is some of you I know, some of you I recognize from previous conversations, not everybody. I would like to invite everybody just to do a quick check. I think everybody is, oh, I'm testing now. Let me change my name because that'll distract me. I don't know why on my computer, for whatever reason, it doesn't believe that I am who I say I am. It keeps making me into it. This is alternate character testing. Um, so, um, so my name is Brian Herrera. I'm a professor of theater and gender and sexuality studies at Princeton University, and I'm a performance historian, and my primary area of specialization is the legible presence and absence of people we would today recognize as Latinx, Latino, or Latina in the longer history of U.S. popular entertainment and performance. And if you've joined me in previous conversations, as I know some of you have, we've been sort of walking in some ways through the 20th centuries. We've been doing 20 or 30-year jumps, thinking about how Hollywood film and the mainstream film industry, or at least the apparatus of what we have from Hollywood film, has seen or not has been able to sort of wrap its brain around the idea of Latinidad, or the stories or the characters or the performances of Latino-ness. We began a few weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, I think it was, 6 or 7 weeks ago, we looked at a film by featuring Carmen Miranda. And then 3 weeks ago, we looked at West Side Story. And so we went from the 1930s, 40s to the 1950s, 60s, and now we're going to the 1970s, 80s. In 3 weeks, we'll be gathering again to talk about 90s, 2000s with the film Selena. But tonight, we're looking at a really remarkable example of independent Latino film, independent Chicano film, called Zoot Suit, directed by Luis Valdez, based on his own play of the same name, a drama with music that was first staged in Los Angeles and then staged on Broadway briefly, and then remade as a film. So in the space of 5 years, this property had a variety of different iterations. As previously, what I generally do in these conversations is I'll open up with some framing commentary, a little bit of context, but then generally I'd like to run these conversations for the next almost an hour that we are together as a kind of a choose your own adventure. I'll still be doing most of the talking, but I'll be letting your questions, your comments, your observations guide me as I offer the additional information that might be relevant for your appreciation of the film. The thing to say about the film, once again, I'm going to loop back a little bit to what I was just naming, which was, it was made by Luis Valdez. Luis Valdez is one of the most important figures in Latino drama. He's called by many the father of Chicano drama, the inventor of Chicano teatro, a tradition of sort of socially conscious protest theater that emerged in the fields of California in the 1960s. He worked closely with the labor organizer Cesar Chavez to figure out a way that theater could be used as an organizing tool for the union, but then also as a sort of a space that was not solely didactic, that allowed the capacity of theater to be joyful and to sort of be entertaining, to also convey relevant social information, center the concerns of its audience, and then also potentially lead to social transformation or action. The crucial thing that Valdez's company, El Teatro Campesino, did was they took the idea that we might trace back to W.E.B. Du Bois of theater, of the art should be by, for, and about, and near the audience that it prioritizes. So instead of asking, so Mr. Terry Anderson, can you, okay, we got it, okay. So instead of asking the audience to come to the theater, what Valdez did was he brought the theater to the audience. And in the case of his labor work in the fields of California, that literally meant bringing the theater on often truck beds to the workers as they took their lunch breaks in various parts of the field. And so he comes out of this very advocacy oriented, activist oriented tradition of theater, but then as his work evolves, it sort of starts in the fields, moves to the tradition of El Teatro Campesino, moves in important ways to college campuses and community centers in the early 1970s. And in the middle 1970s, he partners with Center Theater Group in Los Angeles to develop his first sort of traditional show, which was what becomes Zoot Suit, which was first presented on a limited 6 or so week run in one of the smaller theaters by Center Theater Group. If you're familiar with Los Angeles, Center Theater Group also has the Mark Taper Forum. It's one of the most prestigious theaters in the region, and Let me just ask everybody here to make sure they're muted. Can I interrupt Mr. Connolly? Okay, let me just check. Okay, great. With the Center Theater Group, they launched this production of Zoot Suit with many of the actors you saw in the film. And they launched it for what was expected to be a standard sort of 6-week run. It sold out within seconds. It kept selling out. They moved it to the big theater. It kept selling out. It was this huge phenomenon with different people arriving to the theater in Los Angeles that had ever arrived before. It went to Broadway, and it went to Broadway in a highly heralded production and closed within a month. Audiences did not show up, critics did not understand it, and it closed within a month. But within 2 years, Valdez partnered again with Center Theater Group to use one of their performing spaces as both the exterior and the set for much of what we see in this film. And so this restaging of the play on stage, instead of using a sound stage, of using an actual stage to build out a cinematic vision of what this play was, what it was for. And so this film didn't do a huge amount of business, didn't get a lot of critical acclaim, but it's become a quite beloved film in certain communities, and sort of a widely studied and a widely taught film in Chicano and Latino studies, because it does document this crucial moment in Chicano and Latino cultural production. And so the film, as you've looked at it, it tells a historical story, but it adapts that historical story with all kinds of flourish. And it does so using a variety of styles, both theatrical and cinematic styles, that it's not really seeking coherence. And so part of what, in terms of stylistic coherence, there is a way in which there's an intentionality of sort of moving between melodrama and agitprop and musical numbers and sort of didactic mechanisms, all is sort of part of what the play was doing, but also Valdez chooses to not do what a lot of folks, when they adapt a stage work to the cinema, he chooses not to sort of veneer over the stylistic jumps that happen in the script. And so it makes for a really interesting film. The thing to know about the film is most of the cast in the film, not everybody in the film, but most of the cast in the film are the cast that had traveled with the production through Los Angeles to Broadway and back again. Especially the principal characters, the principal actors are many of the same. You might have recognized Edward James Olmos, who is the one actor of El Teatro Campesino who ends up, wasn't a member of the troupe, but becomes affiliated with the troupe and deeply collaborated with the troupe as a known advocate for the troupe because of Zoot Suit. But then other folks like Rose Portillo, who plays Della, Alma Lopez, who plays the sister, like a number of these folks are sort of core players within El Teatro Campesino, both before and after. And so this is both a launching pad. You might have noticed another number of other younger famous faces, but it is an interesting footnote in the history, but it's also a crucial juncture of what happens when, instead of what we've looked at with Carmen Miranda and West Side Story, what happens when Anglos sort of tell the story, use Latino stories, themes, music, and characters to tell the story. What happens when somebody who themselves identifies with the community to being depicted? What's the slight difference there? So that's just some framing, some context that might be of interest and relevance, but I'd be very interested to hear what your questions are and to see how that might guide our conversation for the next 45 minutes. So I'll just be looking for hands. For those of you who have pictures, you can also use you can also use the, okay, so Ms. Bachbaum, I see a hand.
Hi, yes, I have a language question. Is the term Pachuco derogatory if it's used, was it used from outside the Chicano community, or was it sort of a point of pride within the community?
I would say yes, and I think we saw that in this, that it's a charged term. It's okay. A charged term, and like many charged terms, it would be a term that could be used as an epithet, but also could be reclaimed as a term of pride. And I think that, like the name Chicano itself, which was sometimes, as we saw, even, like, don't call yourself a Pachuco, don't, I am a Pachuco, this kind of generational argument that is staged in the piece was not unlike the generational arguments that occurred around the term of Chicano as a designation. So there is this way of like, don't call yourself like that, don't exceed to the demand, don't sort of accept the assumptions of the mainstream culture, like you are not just that, but then also taking it as a point of pride. And indeed, so the term Pachuco was Pachuco Boogie and those kind of things. Like these were songs, popular songs. There was a kind of way that Zoot Suit was both in the Northeast, and both in New York and Chicago and California, was considered to be kind of dangerous. Like it was not necessarily the upstanding citizens who wore that. It was sort of folks who were on the edge of perhaps being perceived as being criminal or being sort of a subculture that was not always respected. But within that subculture, it was a respected culture. So there's this element, and I think as we've seen over the generations and decades of the last 80 years, Pachuco has become a particular term of reclamation, that there's certain kind of subcultures, car clubs, sort of when Zoot Suit was revived in Los Angeles for a 40-year anniversary production, there were all these folks who showed up in full Pachuco style as a sort of wearing Zoot Suits, coming in the cars, like we see in the opening of the film, this sort of way of sort of saying this is our heritage, as much as it's been diminished and debased by the Anglo authority structures. There's also a part of it that is a proud heritage. So that balance of both and it's one of those words that depends on who's using it, that it might sound differently depending on whose mouth it's coming out of.
Right. Thank you.
Sure. Catherine.
Hi there. So just first of all, I thought this was fantastic. I'd never seen it. I think I had heard one of the songs possibly, but that's about it. And so just thanks for introducing it to us. And there were a lot of connections that I made because of the series between West Side Story and The Gang's All Here. So I appreciated starting to link that chain together. Just to dig more into Pachuco, what about the character? Right? He's more than a character. He's like this MC, he's a spiritual figure. Only we see him, other than, Hank, of course. He's sort of an angel and a devil on his shoulder at once, a trickster. There are just so many facets to him. And obviously, because I have liked it and shared that, obviously I found him enticing, but I'm curious if you could just talk about maybe the inspiration for that or whatever else you think would be contextualizing this figure.
Well, you're naming a gap that I didn't realize, and my knowledge I didn't know I had, which was, I don't know what the idea behind the Pachuco was, like the character of El Pachuco as the central character. And in some ways, what is so interesting about the character is he is constantly thwarting our expectations and assumptions. Like Valdez uses him in the way that we, like that, the mistake that often gets made is when we'll see the first character who's talking to us and we think they're the lead character in the show, and we realize that actually he is, but he isn't. And what I love about the arc is the fact that what you've named is he plays that role of, is he the MC? Is he the omniscient narrator? Is he a voice in Henry's head? Is he a figment of our imagination? Like, what is he? And also he plays that the arc of it is also, we begin to realize, like just as Hank does in different points, of is he to be trusted? And I think part of what opens up is the coyote figure, the sort of the trickster figure, the sort of some folks have made analogies to thinking about him in relation to the MC character in Cabaret, sort of serving a sort of a similar dramaturgical function. In the first voice we hear the charismatic excitement, and then by the end of that film, if you know that film, you're going like, oh, are you the fun face of fascism? I didn't realize that. It's like this idea of the way a charismatic musical presence can sometimes distract us. And there is a tradition in the 10 years in the period in which this show emerged. We see shows like, we see Fosse's film adaptation of Cabaret. We also see Fosse's stage presentation of Pippin, which uses also an interesting trickster, narrator, host figure that it's not always clear if they're a force for good in the world of the story. And I think Pachuco plays that, but also what's really El Pachuco is the iconic image of the show. Like you may, I don't have images, I didn't prepare images, but the poster the poster of the film, the poster of the production is always El Pachuco with the black suit and the red shirt and the reclined stance, the sort of the long lens stance, the stance that we see all of the entire cast take in the final moment of the show. This sort of long leg, sort of strut stance, like where somebody caught mid strut, where they're leaning back but their leg is out. You know, that kind of sort of studied, casual, like, but it's a lot of work to do it too. That sort of that idea. So I think Pachuco, what I find the character, and it was a star-making role for Olmos. Olmos's career blossomed as a result of the prominence and the success here. Within a decade, he became an Oscar-nominated actor, and in some ways, his work had been going prior to this film, but this was the film, this was the property that really accelerated why he got the role on Miami Vice, all these kinds of things, like how his career sort of really blossomed. And in some ways, it is this really interesting playing in this space of charisma, and both an iconic look, an iconic sound, and also the thread that unites the fact that stories are not to be trusted, that stories are always guided. Like, what I think the crucial argument of the play is that there are different versions to every story, and many of them are, so who's telling you the story? Whose story are you believing? And even if, like, sometimes the mythic stories are as pernicious as the stories that are clearly sort of disparaging, like I do think it's no mistake that in a crucial moment, and this was an innovation that they did a version of this on stage, but what I love about this cinematic replication of the stage show is how he literally sort of breaks through the newspaper. You know, how his first arrival in some ways is one of his major first arrivals is he arrives through the newspaper. And that's this moment where he sort of tears the story, the official story. He breaks through the official story, but then he's always there, like he's answering back with the judge. He's playing with these other voices. He's even speaking to Henry himself in his head. Like, is that what you mean? Is that what you mean? He's always in a space that disrupts what we think for sure is true. And that gets to a point where it gets boiled down to the elemental. And there's that crucial moment when his suit turns from black to white. There's a certain moment when he literally goes into a mobile spirit, which is where we sort of get to in the transition, when we find out that they've finally been freed, and then we have the different competing versions of what happened to Henry Reina afterwards. So that concluding moment when we see this sort of crucial spiritual moment of transition where Henry and the spirit of Pachuco shifts, like the suit shifts color. He's been stripped down to the loincloth. He's become the brother. He's not become the brother. All these things are going on. And then following that slippage of identity is the moment where we see the different iterations of Henry Reina, went to prison, came out, struggled, went back to prison, became drug addicted, died at 48. Then we have the other one. No, Henry Reina went into the Navy, was decorated as a war hero. No, Henry Reina became a family man, and now his kids are going to college are all college students. And this sort of fracturing of that, and so everybody becomes El Pachuco. So through Henry Reina, everybody carries the spirit of this rebellion. Everybody carries the spirit of this resistance in their different forms. Some of the forms that are the official stories, and then there's these other forms of survival and so I think what we get with Pachuco is what we get with a lot of trickster characters, which is disrupting our confidence in the story as it's told, and as unreliable narrators forcing us to really think about what is the story we're believing, what is the story in our head that we're using, and how does it collide with the story as other stories that might be as true. And so so that's my riff. I don't know where the inspiration comes from in terms of what Valdez is. I'm sure he's told the story and I just don't know it, in terms of where he got the idea for Pachuco as this sort of vision. But I do think what we do know is it is also a reclamation act of choosing to go back to the music of Lalo Guerrero and Marijuana and Pachuco Boogie, and capturing the popular culture of a generation of resistors and rebels and fighters for cultural autonomy and pride from the 40s, and to sort of remind this rising generation of youth activists in the 60s and 70s that you're not the first ones to fight this fight. We have a heritage of resistance. Let's learn from that. And that's a big part of the way that Valdez's work was evolving in this time, because he began with these didactic comedic plays, but then he began to move out into genres of plays called the corrido, which typically told a heroic story based on song, and also a mito, which was sort of creating mythic, an alternate cosmology, an alternate myth system. And I think Pachuco sort of exists in all of those. So yes, Ms. Martin.
Thank you. I'm wondering, why do you think that this only lasted 5 weeks on Broadway?
Well, there's a few reasons, I think. And it's been one of the most interesting. It's within Latino theater studies. It's a often explored tale. Like, is it simply was it simply sort of racist reviewing? And there is plenty of racist reviews that you can point to. And when you pull up the New York Times review, and you might look it up if you have a Time subscription, you can look it up and find the review pretty easily from March of 1979. And the reviewer sort of goes through and says, the opening line says something like, "Zoot Suit, like the garment it's named off, is a lot of stuff draped on a spindly form." And he sort of goes through and narrates, like saying it's trying to be social commentary and agitprop and musical gaudy, and none of the pieces really cohere. And which is not an uncommon practice for reviewers encountering culturally specific work, that they misrecognize artistic ambition as artistic overreach. And so they sort of think that, so the argument of the review is basically Valdez doesn't know what a play is, doesn't know how to do it, it's just not competent. It wasn't ready for Broadway, it wasn't fully baked. Instead of recognizing the fact that actually all of this was pretty intentional, all of this was pretty much built in the same way. So that's one piece of it. Another piece of it is there is a sort of a standing cultural bias that the stories of Mexican Americans are really only legible to West Coast audiences. And so one of the interesting headlines of the review is "A Los Angeles Story." Instead of understanding that cultural specificity can activate awareness of universality, there's often a way that certain kinds of, especially work by minoritized writers, the cultural specificity is seen as a liability of its appeal or its interest or its relevance. And so there was that kind of thing. There was also an expectation that some really flat-footed marketing that just assumed that Puerto Ricans would show up in droves to a musical about to a show about Mexicans. So there's a way of not really knowing how to market it. And so there's a few different things, but I think part of it was that the producers had such confidence coming in from the extraordinary explosive success of it in Los Angeles that they just assumed that because it was not expected to be a success, but the audience interest kept meeting it and kept making it a success. So I think there was an expectation that would happen in New York as well. And my impression is they didn't have the reserve capitalization for it to push long enough. And I haven't tracked it to know if it was open long enough to be not Tony nominated, if that was one of the features of it. But it did seem, my understanding is the story, it didn't have enough backup capital when audiences didn't show up in droves. It also had the misfortune of being booked into one of the largest venues, one of the largest Broadway theaters in New York City, the Winter Garden, which is a huge theater with a huge capacity. So the amount of numbers of seats that, instead of being in a smaller house, and that's the sort of the business realities of Broadway. If bigger houses it's harder to run a show in a big house. Which is one of the most iconic images that I love is a picture of Luis Valdez with Cesar Chavez standing in front of the Broadway marquee, and it's at the Winter Garden Theater, and it's one of those images that has a different resonance. If it had been a success, there would have been an interesting moment of the first big show about Puerto Ricans premiering at the Winter Garden, West Side Story, and then 22 years later, the first big show about Chicanos at the same theater, but it has a different resonance now. And so what ended up happening was the first show on Broadway to depict Mexican-American experience, to be directed by a Mexican-American, was remembered and considered for a sort of a major flop. And so it, in the sort of the crude economics of the entertainment industry, that made it harder to sort of believe that there would be an audience for shows that would center Latino experience, especially shows centering Latino experience written by Latino content creators. So the flop, I think, goes for a few different reasons. I do think that one of the other pieces of it, and this is something that is very striking, when I saw the production of the revival, the 40th anniversary production in Los Angeles, One of the things that was really striking to me watching it on stage was how unremarkable a lot of its formal intervention was in 2017. And then it caused me to remember that, like, oh yeah, in 1979, we didn't see a whole lot of shows with musicals drawing from popular music catalogs. In the 20-teens, it's hard to find a musical that doesn't draw from an existing popular musical catalog, you know. And in 1979, there was a real sort of formal coherence of what a musical was supposed to look and sound like. And so a show that had big musical numbers, that wasn't about character, singing in character, or that the music didn't necessarily drive the story, was sort of like, what is this? But we began to see in the intervening 40 years a lot of plays that use music in ways that were much more like that, as well as musicals that began to use music in different forms. So there was a lot of ways where I think this sort of mix of intentional style, this intentional mix of styles that Valdez was doing in 1979 was a little bit more avant-garde than I think was sort of typical on Broadway at the time, and was misrecognized, as I mentioned at the beginning, was misrecognized as a misfire or a failure, as opposed to a sort of a signal of artistic vision. So it was seen like he didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know what lane to pick. And instead of saying, no, he knew exactly what he was doing, because he was trying to create these sort of play with our expectations of how stories are supposed to look and play them against themselves, so we could open up this other set of questions, which is maybe not so commercial. And that might have been the other final piece of it. But the show has not had a major New York revival in the 40 years since. And so I think it's though the show has been widely staged in the West Coast and various professional and amateur productions, and it is widely studied and still widely beloved, and it has a few different legendary productions. The notable productions are the original Los Angeles run, and then a revival up in near San Juan Bautista, which is where El Teatro Campesino is, a little bit up north, but then a major production in Mexico in the early 20-teens, which was an important sort of revisitation of this idea of what we'll see in Selena, for example, was this idea that Mexican theater audiences understood it in a way that American theater audiences often struggled with. And so there was something that then I think led Valdez to be willing to do a major revival. And in some ways, the restaging in the 40th year anniversary production, it wasn't clear to me whether or not how much they were thinking toward Broadway at that time, because it seemed like it could be, but it didn't make the leap. Yes, Craig, Mr. Bensix.
Hi, I thought what was really interesting was the point of view. So normally it's like, as a viewer, you're watching, but in this case, you didn't really know what part of the movie you were part of. You got to watch the audience. Sometimes you felt like you were watching a play. Sometimes you felt like you were part of the story. I mean, I thought that was very unusual in terms of point of view.
Yeah, and it is one of the interesting things. If you could see that, if you know the film La Bamba, that's Luis Valdez's next film after this, and he got so much grief for some of his experimental choices in Zoot Suit that he decided, I'm going to make a regular film. And so he made La Bamba, like a film that looked like a regular movie, that had the sort of standard authorial point of view of a cinematic director. And in this, but I think what's interesting about Zoot Suit from the perspective you name is that he uses the camera in ways to sort of allow us to sort of inhabit different points of view, and also like to sort of manifest nostalgia in particular ways. We sort of like, it's unlike a live filmed performance where we will often see like a performance happening on stage that'll have cutaway to an audience. There's the way that the audience is used as a sort of in dialogue with the performance. Like there's moments when like they run out in the audience like they might in a play, but then there's other times when you actually see this family coming to see their story in some ways. Like we arrive to the theater through the lens of an audience member, but then there's that remarkable moment when we are in the courtroom and we have this turn to look at the audience in the courtroom. It's right around the time I think Della might be sent off to reform school or whatever. And they have a cutaway to the family, and we realize the family is surrounded by the audience in the theater. So it opens up these questions of performance and theatricality in all these different ways. It plays with those, and it asks us to sort of glide into sort of these more, like there's that incredible scene of them sort of walking down the hallway of the jail cell. Like there's these other things that are almost expressionistic in their framing, where there's a kind of heightened color, a heightened perspective, a kind of a sort of a haunted house feel. And then there's other times when we're like it's a madcap comedy with Roz Russell, but it's Tyne Daly and the mimeograph boy. You know, there's these other tone shifts that the camera framing does. And I do think it's the fact that part of what Chicano theater, one of the core aesthetic premises of Chicano theater, is what is called rascuatismo, or rascuache, which is a term that is basically like you use the junk around the yard to make the thing beautiful, like sort of repurposing existing stuff in a way that is often sort of like incongruous, but it opens up a new set of beauty. And so I do think using the junk, using the available materials, but putting them together in a way that makes a different kind of transformative beauty is in some ways what I see going on aesthetically for Valdez in this film. Is he's using the different tropes, the different styles and stuff like this. And he's not interested in stylistic coherence, because in some ways that isn't what the film needs. The film needs these sets of shifting perspectives, this sort of hyper stylization of, like, I love the way these veteran actors, who are already veteran actors, the veteran Chicano actors, but I love also the judge and the, you know, who you probably recognize that actor but didn't know his name because he's been in everything. You know, some of you might have recognized that one of the other white guys was the dad from That 70s Show. You know, there's these kind of sort of working men actors who are able to inhabit this kind of stylized kind of like playing. Like, I love the way the judge is portrayed, where he's just sort of no nuance, just terrible racist judge. And that is done as both a kind of a political point, but also a little bit satiric. And then that shifts from like that beautiful empathetic scene between Della and Henry at the toward the end, when they're sort of when the guard lets them touch over the partition. You know, so he shifts in and out of different presentational styles as well. And I think one of the things that it can be jarring and it can be dissatisfying as a viewer sometimes, but I think what it does suggest is there's a measure of intentionality to it that is worth listening for the provocation in. And I mean, everybody, like, this film is as frustrating as it is delightful, but it is, I think there is a kind of an interesting intentionality working all the way along. And it is sort of full of those surprises. I don't know if that engaged fully the question, but that's sort of where the prompt took me, because you're right. It's a fascinating mix. And I think the way that it uses the audience and the way that it chooses to be it doesn't, because often with theatrical presentations, we talked about a little bit this with West Side Story, with cinematic adaptations of stage properties, there's an idea of trying to erase the stage from, like, get rid of all the stage, like open it out, get rid of the fact that this was ever on stage, try to find a way so it feels like it's in the real world. And in this case, the real world was what matters about the real world is the community that cared about this story. That's the only part that's in the real world, is the community that cares to see this story. And what's so intentional when you see how we cast that audience, it's a multiracial audience, it's an audience that's multi-generational, and it's an audience that is thrilled to learn this story that many folks have not learned the story of the Sleepy Lagoon, of the trial of Sleepy Lagoon. So it's interesting where reality is in this.
Thank you.
Sure.
I just want to add, I had no idea, I'm embarrassed to say, I didn't know that either of those events portrayed in the movie were based on actual events. Yep. And I had to go read and look it up afterwards. And I was really, astounded in a bad, obviously in a hurtful way, that this was going on during World War II, where Navy soldiers came in and beat up these young people and committed such crimes. I really had no clue, and I thought it was just important for that alone, that to bring that awareness, mm-hmm. that the Navy actually changed their policy because of that incident. And there's a good example of using this genre just for plain educational purposes.
Well, and in some ways, the it was a story when it was presented in the middle 1970s, in the late 1970s. It was a story that was largely at that point forgotten. But also remember at the time, the internment of Japanese Americans was widely forgotten. And in that same period, it was sort of vaguely known about, but it wasn't like the stories had not come out again. There had been a sort of way that the ways that the United States government operated against its own citizens or manipulated its own policies to target certain bodies in that period did not align with the idea of what World War II was supposed to be about. And so it was sometimes hard to sort of, and so what's been interesting is that Zoot Suit, the property, the musical, the film, the play, whatever we want to call it, it really did activate a whole generation of scholarship that really evinced sort of these kinds of cases, of which there were many in California and in Hawaii, that where this, because of course Los Angeles was an important port of call, so there were lots of folks from all parts of the country that were there, and then the Zoot Suit itself was considered to be anti-American or anti-patriotic because it was an abundance of fabric as opposed in an era of austerity. So there was this idea that there was something disrespectful about wearing so much fabric. It was sort of considered an FU to the American military effort. And that's again where, as we see the character that Tyne Daly plays, we see her saying, they think you don't actually have a mind. They think you're a propagandist puppet. They don't believe that you are a human, that you have families, that you're a community, that this is just your way of blowing off steam. They think this is a nefarious, that you are a tool of another government. And so, and one of the key symbols, and this was the way that Zoot Suits, and this kind of attack on people wearing Zoot Suits, men and women, Black, Latino, Anglo, were happening across the country. It was considered to be sort of a mechanism of sort of American pride to sort of strip down somebody wearing. It wasn't uncommon for somebody wearing a Zoot Suit, especially if they were a person of color, whether a male or female, for them to be assaulted by a group of military men and have their clothes stripped from them, because it was considered to be. I had no idea. Yeah, so it's, and the Zoot Suit itself was, as you might know, from previous encounters with the Zoot Suit as a style, was a style that really was across the country, mostly in minoritized communities, working class communities that were Black and mostly Black communities in New York and Chicago, but then Mexican American communities in Los Angeles. And so there were women Zooters who also encountered the same kind of violence, and so it's because we see the characters, we see Berta, who's the tough one, who's the tough woman, who's the one who's the we see her figured, but there is also women who wore pants, women who were wearing blazers, women who were wearing the Zoots at the same time, and there's testimony of them being assaulted as well. So so there was a way in which the idea of which kind of dress, as we saw later in West Side Story, in some ways, of this kind of idea of sort of war colors, of this sort of battle. And what was key too was there was a sense of, as we saw in The Gangs All Here and other films of that era, there was a sense of, are you with us or against us in this war effort? And there was a deep paranoia in the period of the riots, a deep paranoia that Spanish-speaking communities in the United States might not be pro-American. And so there was a real bias and a real over-enforcement of immigration policies, where folks got rounded up, even if they were citizens, and sent and dropped back in the middle of Mexico. So a lot of practices that were going on under the name of national security that would be shocking, or continue to be shocking, as the stories continue to be discovered and told. So it's a fascinating story, and there's been a bunch of really interesting books written about it since, in a variety of different registers. There's a couple good PBS pieces that talk about that. So there's more research to be done, but it is, I think, also the ways in which so much of the way that the American media industry, and especially television, news, magazines, was so East Coast driven, that sometimes the stories that happened that were very much about immigrant and ethnic communities in the West Coast. It took a while. It took the next 30 or so years for those stories to even become legible and comprehensible, because so many people publishing books, authoring books, sort of all the major publishers were in New York. So there was a kind of way that that bias I named of, this is a Los Angeles story, it's not really relevant to most of America, that actually did lead to the silencing of the stories of the experiences, especially of Mexican Americans and Japanese Americans during World War II. And this is, of course, also one of the things that's really subtle about the political critique that Valdez offers here, is he says, like, he tells the story of Henry Reina. He comes out, he struggled with addiction, he went back into jail for a while, he died before he was 50. There's that one epilogue, and that is the life that Henry Levas, who this character of Hank Reina is mostly based on, that aligns with his life. But I always find it really interesting that the next story that is told is the story of a Korean War veteran. And what we see, like the other version of Henry Reina's story, is of a Korean War veteran. And that is sort of a subtle shout out to not only how many Mexican Americans served in World War II, but that Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans and other Latinos were emphatically some of the most overrepresented ethnic groups in the military during the Korean and Vietnam War. So in terms of actual numbers of population compared to how many folks were fighting in those wars, Mexican Americans are way overrepresented. So
I think the military was always a proving ground to for young men, obviously. Even
and it's a space of mobility. It's a space of mobility. It's a space. It's in some ways the counterposition, and this remains the case if you're looking. It's the military industrial complex or the prison industrial complex. Like, one way to stay out of prison is to go into the military. So especially if you're working class and don't have necessarily access to education, which Mexican Americans in the 1950s generally did not have. The same access to second education. And yes, and Terry mentioned in comments that that there was a conversation about the propaganda efforts and how much the newspapers were really, in some ways, the ones who fomented the conflicts, because the newspapers were really big on Zoot Suit, on the riots on Olivera Street, the riots, this idea of Mexican American violence, and that was really driven by the sort of the subtweet, the sort of the blind item that Tyne Daly's character mentions, which is the media mogul in San Simeon, which is a direct reference to William Randolph Hearst. And so this idea that was kind of a propagandist sort of thing, like we live in an era where there's a lot of, we've seen this year a lot of conversation about which media outlets are promoting who's the source of which violence is being seen in the uprisings and riots around the country, and this idea of how in the era of the newspaper that could really name what the story is, and that's in some ways what the Hearst narrative was suggesting, was that these Zoot Suiters were anti-American, anti-patriotic. So we're in some ways the language in the Hearst papers did create the context that would lead young military men to sort of say that they are against us, they are anti-us. So we're gonna like, and it is that question of where's the collusion and what story is being trusted? Is it the story that's being depicted by the attorneys, the story being depicted in the media, the stories that the people tell themselves? And of course, as we saw in the reenactment of the actual event, and this is something historians have really worked to try to parse through, it's like any complicated event. There were misunderstandings. It wasn't always clear who was who. Like it was not an easy what was happening, but somebody just decided to take the blame. And in that remarkable sequence, when they say that they can't tell them apart, so we're going to make them stand up, and it becomes sort of a garish vaudeville of how just sort of what a show trial it was, using some of these terms. It is part of Valdez's sort of reintegration, and that's another thread of what was going on in the Chicano theater movement, was really talking about making legible the ways that both police and judicial structures were organized in ways that were not always respecting the foundational citizen rights or human rights or any other, like we're just assuming that Mexicans were criminal, and sort of to begin to understand the miscarriages of justice. But which are things that we've seen happen a lot with juries and court cases around African American stories. But this was a moment of trying to understand how, in certain contexts, like California and Texas in particular, there are a lot of very comparable stories of racialized justice and racialized injustice that were not part of the historical consciousness. And so how to bring an entertaining story that would activate a different awareness, how this might be why certain communities do not have the same relationship with the police. But of course, some of the police that we see are also Mexican American. So Valdez is very intentional about how complicated and how multifaceted the community is. So time always flies so quickly with y'all. So we got time for at least one more question, maybe a couple. Grant, do you have anything? I just like, where's Grant? He's got a question. Yeah, Grant, go ahead.
So it seemed like Craig said, it was very like unconventional to filming. It seemed like it was obviously both from a play director transitioning to film. I was wondering if you could speak on that, like just the sort of collaboration of both transitioning to film. It seemed like he wanted to essentially film the stage play, but also transition into cinema.
Well, he had been working in different ways with cinema, but not with a sort of full, like he'd been working in very independent sort of cinema stuff. There's some early productions that are filmed for public television, sort of using, because the 1970s was a huge period where a lot of local public television stuff. So there's some things where he's working in different ways. But one of the early projects, he did an early film in 1968. So he had been working, understanding that film could reach differently and film could have a different impact. Not really aiming financially, but understanding that it can have a different kind of way of shaping what stories look like. What I do think what we see here is that one of the key producing partners of this is Center Theater Group. So I do think there is a measure of both understanding that this is how to understand this as a potential film and a film that didn't do that well in box office, but played regularly on early HBO. So it was one of the immediately released on early home video. So it ended up being in the circulation. So I do think that there are some ways of he was like using a property he knew very well to then experiment with what it would be like to be a storyteller using a visual media. And then I think when he goes to La Bamba, where it's utterly almost conventional filmmaking, it's an interesting leap in terms of how to understand the mediums and how they might be in dialogue together. But this is a time when he's moving from I don't know that his work in this period as a playwright and as a theater director is also beginning to explore much more what we might consider naturalistic or domestic scenes, which we can see finally in La Bamba. But it was not really what he was working in. He was working in the stylization that we see in theater. And I think cinema has often struggled with how to do stylization that is based on like, I don't know if you know this, the 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T. Like there's some ways when we start thinking about the stylization on cinema that's not driven by camera technique, but more by sort of acting technique or design technique, that's sometimes a janky point of connection. And I think he was still really working, a lot of these sets are by the same theatrical designers. So there was a sense of, we're going to play with the theatrical vocabulary and how does it work on film? So I think there's a real sort of experimental aspect to it. I don't know that there was much in the way that thinking that this was going to be a box office success. I mean, this was the era of Grease and Xanadu and Fame and stuff like this. So musicals were being successful, but not necessarily sort of high concept sort of like, so this, but this is also the period of the Apple. So there was a lot of ways where musicals were doing a lot of experimentation right now because they weren't considered to be a current form. So I think it might have been throwing out stuff to see if it stick. It turns out it didn't, but it had an enduring impact. I don't know if that answers your question, but I do think it is part of what we can see now in retrospect. Whereas critics, when they saw it, they had the same kind of reaction to it as they did to the theater piece, where they just thought it was a novice director, didn't know what he was doing. But I think looking back on it, we can say he does know what he's doing. It might not be the right choice, but he knows what he's doing.
Absolutely answer my question. Thank you so much.
Great. Erika, did I see you? Are you going to ask me a question or are you just showing me your face?
I could do both. Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how Luis Valdez and his reputation and how he portrays women versus men and the stories that they told, and that continues, seems nagging. In Zoot Suit, obviously, similarly, we have a lot of very strong male roles. Can you speak a little bit about the, about the female roles and their, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that that's one of the things that Zoot Suit is, there's an argument within Chicano and Latino historiography, Chicano Latino theater historiography, about the question of, and there's some interesting controversies within the field about the ways in which women in El Teatro Campesino and the roles, because what happens in Zoot Suit is it's part of this bridge to telling a family story. And because in the ensemble of El Teatro Campesino, women are everywhere. Women are doing all kinds of different things. And a lot of the shows that are much more stylized and shorter, or all this kind of, something happens in Zoot Suit where he's depicting characters that have sort of real world corollaries, where he's doing a nostalgia piece. He's writing in the 70s about the 40s, that there ends up being a sort of a reassertion of certain kinds of troping of virgin whore, of idealized mother, of all these things. And these are, and so what we see is these actors who in the troupe did all kinds of other work. Here, what we see them is in these very narrow roles. And indeed, that is sort of what Valdez's work in the subsequent decade ended up continuing, really dealing with sort of pretty basic gender configuration. So I think that it's an interesting, the fact that this was the big breakthrough show. This was the first show that was really outside of the El Teatro company sort of model, and the model of the teatro model of sort of self-generated work. But Diane Rodriguez, who is the legendary theater leader, who was actually in El Teatro Campesino and has a couple small parts in Zoot Suit, often talked about the paradox of how what it was actually like to be a woman in the company was very different than what people say, what they think women were. So it's this interesting thing that Zoot Suit does everything that the patriarch Valdez does, which is he's not shy about claiming authority. He's not shy about taking up space. So he does a lot of that kind of patriarch genius kind of stuff. And this piece doesn't really reach beyond pretty broad outlines for its characters in any sense. And that especially lands hard on the women. And that's where we see like, you look at the women and you see how much work they're doing. Like when you look at how much work Lupe Ontiveros is investing in that character, and she's got like 2.5 words. Then also like what Rose Portillo does with Della, adding layers of complexity, not in the script. So what we find them, what's remarkable is it's remarkably conventional in terms of Hollywood cinema. The women are underwritten and are over scripted in certain kind of paradigms. The men have complexity and nuance and much more words to express it with. And so here, what we do see is, as much as he's working on a counter stereotypy and sort of counter narrative, he does default to sort of boilerplate misogyny in a lot of ways of just sort of not drawing upon the complexity of women. And what ends up happening is in the 80s, we begin to see a lot of women writers, in particular women Latino writers, who are beginning to tell stories rooted in Latino communities that activate some of the humanity and complexity within these cultural paradigms that are also cultural paradigms within the community, but also cultural paradigms that are overdetermined by Hollywood and conventional storytelling as well. So I do think that there is, for example, the chorus of 3 women. The backup singers of El Pachuco are utterly personality free, right? And it's like there is a way in which that was clearly all Valdez needed, and they were the ones that were jobbed in for the most part, like Anakani, who you might, if you know who Anakani is, if you know that name, but Anakani, who was on the Lawrence Welk Show for years. She left the Lawrence Welk Show, and this was her first gig after the Lawrence Welk Show. And he was very excited to hire Anakani because he had watched her singing Mexican songs on the Lawrence Welk Show. But it was not like he brought in somebody who had a lot of personality and could create. There's an opportunity there. And a lot of the subsequent productions who have been staged by other directors, or even the production staged by Valdez's son, Kinan, have often allowed there to be a lot more complexity in the women ensemble members, to sort of open up questions of gender expression among the women. All these things that it's in there, but it wasn't really what his goal was. And I do think that that is, he is the self-determined patriarch, for better and worse, of Chicano and Latino drama. And that's, I think, with the question of the musical as a form also is overdetermined in this way as well. So the musical as a form can overdetermine in terms of ingenue, the good girl, the bad girl, these kind of things. I do want to just note, as by way of closing, that Terry mentioned Like Water for Chocolate is an interesting another story to look at, which is a Mexican film adaptation. But it's actually, there's a musical version of it in the works with the music of Santa Cecilia, which is a notable ensemble, and Chiara Alegría Judas. So that's an interesting musical to keep an eye out for. But the one thing I'd also like you to keep an eye out for, just because I'm such a fan of Rose Portillo, who plays Della in this film. I think she's a lovely actress who just hasn't worked consistently in theater, but hasn't done as much film and television in notable ways. She did play a small part in the series Vida, which was on Stars for a few seasons. But if you happen to see a Subaru ad on television about a Latina granddaughter and her grandmother, like a granddaughter picking her grandmother up at the airport and driving home and getting a milkshake and flirting with a boy, that is Rose Portillo. That is Della from Zoot Suit, and it's just and she's delicious in that little ad, is just as delicious as she was in 1979 in 1979, 1981 in Zoot Suit on Broadway and on film. So one of the things about Zoot Suit is there are so many folks that are in the production that went on to become seriously working actors, that you have it's a core group of actors, of Latino actors in Los Angeles, who end up continuing to work, that you've seen them. And so there's a lot of interesting sort of ways to play with the IMDb page, if you wish. So Catherine is, before the Zoom ends, grab the YouTube link for the video of the ad. I'm assuming that's what that is, Catherine. Is that right? Is that the ad? Okay. And so I hope you'll consider joining me in 3 weeks to watch a very different film. Also a film that opens up different questions about what does it mean with the use of music in telling the Latino story, but then also what that opens up is interesting questions of pan-Latinidad, of what happens when a Puerto Rican actress plays a Mexican character, and some of these other questions, but also with the story of Selena, which is one of the stories that has quickly become one of the oft retold stories of Chicano experience, as a new Netflix series about Selena is preparing to drop just a few weeks after we will be watching this film together. So I think it's November 19th, we'll be coming together for the final series in the Film 101 Latin Numbers series, talking about Selena. So Selena should be easy. If you haven't seen it, you're in for a treat, and it's an extraordinary star-making performance for Jennifer Lopez, but it's also a really remarkable family drama, and it also allows us to revisit Edward James Olmos. So it's going to be building on everything from Carmen to West Side Story to Zoot Suit. All of it's at play. And then there's also Lupe Ontiveros. So there's some points of continuity that, again, we get to sort of continue the conversation in a few weeks. And I look forward to joining you. So seeing some familiar faces. Yeah, Marjorie?
Yeah, can I just add one quick thing? Speaking of ethnic casting, where did they get Tyne Daly to play a Jewish communist? I thought that was pretty funny.
Well, I think that she at that point was that character. She's often played kind of ethnically, sort of like, she plays that ethnic dame across ethnicity in all kinds of ways, as waspy as she is in her own heritage. But there's Jewishness in her too, isn't there? Isn't she half Jewish?
I don't know, but she just looks stereotypically Irish to me. So I didn't know.
Yeah, well, I think it's also that kind of that mix of, because I think she's half Jew. I think she might be Jewish and Irish, but that's sort of her. Like, if you know Tyne Daly, you recognize Tyne Daly in that part, because that's sort of a version of that kind of the tough urban woman that we see there. And it was, I think, one of her, like she had already done a Clint Eastwood, or she was right at the beginning of the brink of her becoming a notable figure. Like, I forget when she did the Clint Eastwood movie, but it was right about that same time. So,
Okay, thank you.
okay. Okay, great. So see you next time, maybe. Nice to see everybody.
Pleasure.
Thank you.